The courthouse doors felt heavier than they should have been, but I pushed through them anyway, my heels clicking against marble that had witnessed 1,000 broken families before mine. My cousin Natalie stood at the centre of the lobby, surrounded by cameras and microphones, her tears perfectly timed, her voice breaking in all the right places as she spoke about protecting our family legacy. I didn't interrupt. I simply walked past her, close enough that she could see the manila folder in my hand, close enough that her performance stuttered for just a fraction of a second. She knew. Or at least, she suspected. The cameras didn't catch it, the brief flicker of panic in her eyes, the way her grip tightened on her lawyer's arm. But I saw it. I'd been watching Natalie my entire life, learning to read the subtle shifts in her expression that meant she was calculating, strategizing, preparing to strike. Today, though, she wasn't the one holding the knife. I was. In my first life, I died at 32, alone in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and defeat. The cancer had taken 18 months to kill me, but the real death had happened years before that. The slow erasure of everything I was, everything I could have been. My father's grave sat in the premium section of Riverside Memorial Park, or so I'd believed for 16 years. A granite headstone with his name, Robert Morrison, the man who had built Morrison Textiles from nothing, who had promised me the world and then left me when I was 12. Except he hadn't left me where I thought he had. The truth came 3 weeks before I died, delivered by a lawyer who had had a crisis of conscience too late to matter. My uncle, my father's younger brother, David, had switched the burial plots. My father lay in an unmarked grave in the cheapest section of the cemetery, while David's eventual resting place occupied the plot my father had purchased, the one overlooking the lake, the one with the marble bench and the cherry tree. David had done it the week after the funeral, when I was too young and too shattered to notice paperwork, too trusting to question why he suddenly needed to handle the estate details. He'd forged my signature. I was 12, who would question it, and transferred everything. The company shares held in trust for me were redirected to a shell corporation he controlled. The life insurance policy had a beneficiary change I never authorised. Even the house, the one my mother and father had bought together, somehow ended up titled to David within a year. My mother never knew. She died 6 months after my father, her heart simply giving up. And I'd gone to live with David's family because there was nowhere else to go. His wife, Patricia, had smiled with cold eyes and given me the smallest bedroom. Natalie, their daughter, 2 years older than me, had watched me like I was an insect she was deciding whether to crush immediately or save for later entertainment. They let me work at Morrison Textiles after college, let me as if it were charity, but only in positions where I could do no real damage to their control. Junior marketing coordinator, then associate manager, never anything with actual authority, never anything close to the boardroom where decisions were made. When I pushed, when I mentioned that my father had built this company and I deserved a real role, David would pat my shoulder with false sympathy and say, "Sienna, you're still learning. These things take time." Natalie, meanwhile, became VP of Operations at 26. The money ran out slowly, then all at once. Medical bills piled up, insurance that should have covered me, my father's generous policy, somehow had been cancelled years ago due to non-payment of premiums, though I'd never received a single notice. David offered to help, of course. He always offered, with that concerned furrow in his brow, that gentle voice that made me feel like I was the problem, like I was irresponsible, like I was lucky to have family that tolerated my constant need for rescue. I took his help. I had no choice, and every dollar he gave me was another chain, another piece of leverage, another reason I couldn't question, couldn't push, couldn't demand the truth about what had happened to my father's legacy. In those final months, when the cancer had spread to my bones and breathing hurt more than it didn't, I'd lie in that hospital bed replaying my life. All the moments I'd been too grateful to question, too afraid to push back, too convinced of my own inadequacy to demand what was rightfully mine. The company meetings where Natalie presented ideas I'd suggested weeks earlier in private conversations. The family dinners where Patricia would sigh about how expensive it was to maintain the family estate, while I worked 3 jobs to pay for treatments my father's insurance should have covered. The way David would bring up my mother's depression, her fragility, implying without saying directly that perhaps I'd inherited her weakness, her inability to cope. In my final week, delirious with morphine, I'd heard Natalie and David talking outside my hospital room. They thought I was asleep, or maybe they didn't care anymore. "When she's gone, we'll need to handle the optics carefully," Natalie had said, her voice crisp and businesslike. "A nice memorial fund in her name, maybe a scholarship. Make it look generous." "The plot next to Robert?" David asked. "God, no, too expensive. There is space in the public section. We'll keep it simple." They'd laughed then. Not cruel laughter, which somehow made it worse. Just casual, the way you might laugh about deciding where to plant a garden or which restaurant to try for dinner. I was already buried to them, already forgotten. I died 2 days later, my hand empty of anyone to hold it. My last thought a numb acceptance that I'd lived my entire life as someone's discarded obligation. And then I woke up, 14 years old, my body unmarked by illness, sitting in freshman English class while Mrs. Patterson droned on about symbolism in The Great Gatsby. My phone, the old model I'd forgotten I once had, buzzed with a text from Uncle David, asking me to come straight home after school. They needed to discuss some family matters. I knew what those matters were. In my first life, this had been the day David sat me down and explained with great solemnity that my father's estate was more complicated than expected, and that I needed to sign some papers to make things easier for everyone. I'd signed them, trusting, grateful that he was handling things I didn't understand. The papers had included authorization for David to act as executor without oversight, transfer of my father's shares to a protective trust that David controlled, and consent to necessary estate expenses that had drained hundreds of thousands over the years. Not this time. I stared at that text message for 5 full minutes while around me teenagers gossiped and passed notes and lived in their small, uncomplicated worlds. My hands weren't shaking. My breathing was steady. The panic I should have felt, the disorientation of impossible memory, of living twice, was absent, replaced by something colder and infinitely more useful. Clarity. I deleted the text. Then I opened my email, the account I barely remembered having, and began to write. The first message went to my father's original lawyer, the one David had quietly replaced. I claimed I'd found some old documents of my father's and wanted to confirm their validity. Could we meet? The second email went to the county records office, requesting copies of all property transfers involving my father's name in the past 2 years. The third went to my school counsellor, explaining that I was having difficulty concentrating due to stress about my father's estate and needed to document everything for my own peace of mind. I was building a paper trail, evidence that I was asking questions, that I wasn't simply signing whatever was put in front of me. When I got home, David was waiting in the living room with Patricia. Natalie sat on the stairs, pretending to do homework, but obviously listening. They all had the same expression, gentle concern masking impatience. "Sienna, sweetie," Patricia began, "we know this has been hard. I need time," I interrupted, my voice small and uncertain. Exactly what they expected from grieving 14-year-old me. To read everything, to understand what Dad wanted. I'm not ready to sign anything yet. David's smile tightened microscopically. Of course, there's no rush, but these are just formalities. Nothing for you to worry your head about. Your father trusted me to handle these things." "Then a few more weeks won't matter," I said, and let my eyes fill with tears. Easy enough when I thought about what they'd stolen, what they'd planned to keep stealing. I just need to feel like I understand, like I'm honouring his wishes. What could they say to that? They exchanged glances and I saw the calculation happening. Push too hard and I might actually start asking the wrong questions. Better to seem patient, to seem understanding, to wait until grief and confusion made me malleable again. Of course, honey, Patricia said. Take all the time you need. But I'd seen David's hand clench around his glass. I'd seen Natalie's eyes narrow. They'd given me weeks. I intended to use months. The transformation happened in increments small enough that no one noticed until it was too late. I stopped asking David for help with homework and hired a tutor with money from my part-time job at the library. I joined the debate team and the business club. I started reading my father's journals, the ones David thought he'd hidden, the ones I now knew were in the attic behind the box of Christmas decorations. My father had been meticulous. Every business decision documented, every contract copied, every concern noted, including his growing unease about David's gambling debts, about the way David had started asking for loans, about how David had suggested combining resources to strengthen the family. One entry, dated 3 months before my father's death, made my hands tremble as I photographed it. David asked again today about making him co-owner of the company. Says it's about family legacy, keeping everything together. But I've seen the credit card statements he left in my office, over $200,000 in gambling debts. He thinks, I don't know. I need to talk to Williams about protecting Sienna's inheritance. Whatever happens to me, David cannot get control of Morrison Textiles. Another entry, 2 weeks before the car accident that killed him. Change the will today. Everything goes to Sienna in an irrevocable trust, managed by Williams until she's 25. David won't like it, but I can't risk everything I've built on his promises to get better. Told him I'd help with the debts once, but this is the third time. Sienna's future matters more than his addiction. My father had known. He'd seen David's weakness and tried to protect me from it. And David had known about the will change, had known he was about to lose access to everything he felt entitled to. I photographed every page, backed them up in 3 separate cloud accounts, and returned the journals exactly as I'd found them. At school, I was careful to remain exactly as mediocre as I'd been in my first life. Average grades, few friends, forgettable. But I began building relationships that mattered, with teachers who might serve as witnesses later, with the school secretary who had access to official records, with the IT teacher who taught me how to properly back up and encrypt files. I also befriended the daughter of a private investigator. We bonded over books, over being quiet girls who preferred observation to participation. I never told her why I was so curious about her father's work, about how investigations were conducted, about what kind of evidence held up in court. She just thought I was interested. At home, I was the perfect, grateful niece. I thanked David and Patricia for everything. I deferred to Natalie. I made myself small and unobtrusive and easy to overlook. I washed dishes without being asked. I kept my room immaculate. I never complained about the smallest bedroom, the hand-me-down clothes, the way Natalie got a new car for her 16th birthday, while I was told cars were earned, not given. And at night, I planned. The first major chess move came 6 months later, at my 15th birthday dinner. David announced with great ceremony that he'd set up a trust fund for me, using money from my father's estate, though he didn't phrase it that way. It would be accessible when I turned 21, he explained. Plenty of time for me to mature and learn responsibility. That's so generous, I said, smiling. But I'm confused about something. My father's lawyer, Mr. Williams, mentioned that Dad had already set up a trust for me. Are these the same thing? The room went silent. Mr. Williams? David's voice was carefully neutral. I wasn't aware you'd spoken with him. Oh, he called a few months ago. I lied smoothly. Just to check in, see how I was doing. He seemed confused about some paperwork. I didn't want to bother you with it." I watched David's face cycle through emotions: surprise, anger, calculation, before settling on benign confusion. "I'm not sure what he was referring to. I've been handling everything with our current attorney, Mr. Harrison. Perhaps there was a miscommunication." "Maybe," I agreed pleasantly. "I probably misunderstood. He used a lot of legal terms I didn't really follow." But the seed was planted. David now knew that Mr. Williams had made contact, that there was someone outside his control who might have information, might have questions. He'd have to be more careful, move more slowly, make sure every document was airtight, which gave me exactly what I needed: time. Patricia excused herself early that evening, claiming a headache. Natalie left the table as soon as dinner was finished, her face tight with annoyance. Only David remained, sipping his wine, watching me with eyes that held a new wariness. "Sienna," he said finally, "I want you to know that everything I've done has been to protect you. Your father would have wanted—" "I know," I interrupted gently. "You've been so good to me, Uncle David. I don't know what I would have done without you and Aunt Patricia." The words tasted like ash, but I said them with perfect sincerity. Let him think I was still the grateful, manageable child he'd expected me to remain. The years passed like a held breath. I turned 16, 17, 18. I graduated high school with honours. Good enough to prove I wasn't stupid. Not so exceptional that anyone would expect great things from me. I was accepted to State University for Business Administration. David seemed pleased that I'd chosen something practical, something that wouldn't interfere with Natalie's trajectory at Morrison Textiles. Natalie had begun working at the company at 22, immediately placed in a management training program that fast-tracked her to executive level. She'd inherited David's taste for control and Patricia's cold charm. At family dinners, she'd talk about the company with proprietary confidence, using phrases like "when I take over" rather than "if." I worked summers at Morrison Textiles too, but in the warehouse, in data entry, in positions where I could observe everything and be noticed by no one. I learned the rhythms of the business, learned which suppliers were reliable, which contracts were profitable, which employees were loyal to the company versus loyal to David personally. I also learned about the shell companies, 3 of them, carefully hidden behind layers of paperwork, all receiving payments from Morrison Textiles for consulting services that didn't exist. Money flowing out of the company my father built and into accounts David controlled. One company was called Riverside Solutions, another Heritage Management Group. The third, Morrison Advisory Services. The name designed to sound legitimate, like an internal department rather than external theft. Between them, they'd siphoned off nearly $2 million over 10 years. I documented everything. Screenshots of transactions, copies of invoices for services never rendered, emails discussing strategic consulting fees that were really just David paying himself. I created a timeline showing when payments increased, always after the company had a profitable quarter, when the missing money would be less noticeable. I also befriended the warehouse manager, a man named Thomas who'd worked for my father since the company's founding. Over lunch breaks, I'd ask him questions that seemed innocent, about how things used to run, about changes David had made, about suppliers that had been replaced. "Your father was a good man," Thomas told me once, his weathered face sad. Fair, honest. When David took over, a lot changed. Not all for the better. Like what? He'd hesitated, clearly weighing loyalty against truth. Suppliers your father trusted, long-term contracts that were solid. David replaced them with cheaper options, saved money on paper, but quality suffered. And some of those new suppliers, I looked into one once, out of curiosity. Address was a PO box, no actual manufacturing facility. Did you tell anyone? I mentioned it to David. He said I should focus on my job, let him handle business strategy. Thomas had looked at me then, really looked. You're Robert's daughter. You've got his eyes, his way of paying attention. I'm just trying to understand the business, I'd said, in case I ever work here for real. I hope you do, he had said quietly. Company needs someone who cares about more than profit margins. At 21, I accessed the trust fund David had created. The small one, the decoy, the one designed to seem generous while hiding how much more should have been there. It contained $85,000. My father's estate had been worth $8 million. I thanked David profusely. I bought a modest car. I got an apartment near campus. I played my role. And then I hired a forensic accountant. Her name was Dr. Rebecca Torres, and she specialized in corporate fraud cases. I paid her with money I'd saved from working multiple jobs, money that had nothing to do with David or his manufactured generosity. I gave her everything, my father's journals, the photographs of documents, the shell company information, the will that specified those cemetery plots. This is meticulous work, she said after 3 weeks of analysis. Whoever you are, you've been planning this for a long time. 7 years, I told her. I need to know exactly how much they took, and I need documentation that will hold up in court. She worked for 6 months. 6 months of analysing every financial record she could access legally, of tracking money through corporate structures designed to hide it, of building a case that was irrefutable. When she finally presented her findings, the report was 300 pages long. They took everything, she said simply. The estate was worth approximately $8 million when your father died. Current value, with proper investment, should be around $15 million. You received less than $300,000 total over 9 years. The rest is gone, redistributed, hidden, spent. Can we prove it? Yes, she said, but understand, this won't be easy. They'll fight. They'll claim legitimate expenses, family support, authorised transfers. Your uncle has been careful. Not careful enough, I said. He didn't know I was watching. She smiled then, a fierce expression that reminded me of hunting birds. No, he didn't, and that's going to cost him everything. I waited until Natalie's 28th birthday to make my move. David threw a party at the Morrison Textiles headquarters, inviting clients and employees and half the city's business community. The event was lavish: open bar, catered food, a live band. Money that should have gone into the company poured into celebrating Natalie's ascension. Natalie wore white, of course she did, and David gave a speech about legacy and family and how proud he was to announce that Natalie would be officially taking over as CEO within the year. He talked about Morrison Textiles like it was his creation, his vision, his legacy to pass down. My father's name was mentioned once, in passing, as the foundation upon which we built. I attended in a simple black dress, carrying a gift bag with expensive wine and a card that wished her every success. I smiled for photos. I chatted with cousins I barely knew. I congratulated Natalie with apparent warmth, watched her accept my words with that particular condescension she reserved for me, the tolerance one shows to lesser beings who know their place. "Thank you, Sienna," she'd said, her hand on my shoulder in a gesture that looked affectionate but felt like ownership. "It means a lot that you're here to celebrate. I know things have been different for you, but you're still family." Different, as if my circumstances were random chance rather than calculated theft. I waited until the speeches were done and the champagne was flowing before I approached David privately. "Uncle David," I said quietly, "I need to talk to you about something. It's about the cemetery." His expression didn't change, but I felt him tense. "The cemetery?" "I was visiting Dad's grave last week, and I noticed something odd about the plot records. There seems to be some confusion about the location. I'm sure it's just a clerical error, but I thought you might know something about it since you handled the arrangements." The colour drained from his face so subtly that only someone watching carefully would notice. "Sienna, this is hardly the time. You're right, I agreed quickly. I'm sorry, it's just been on my mind. Maybe we could meet this week. I have some other questions too about the estate, about some of the financial details. Now that I'm older, I'd like to understand things better. Make sure everything is in order. I saw it then, the flash of real fear. He covered it quickly, smoothing his features into avuncular concern, but not quickly enough. Of course, he said. We'll set something up. I nodded, squeezed his arm affectionately, and walked away. He would spend the next few days frantically checking records, consulting with lawyers, trying to figure out exactly what I knew and how much of his carefully constructed fiction was about to collapse. He would make mistakes in his panic. He would leave trails I could follow. He would contact people he shouldn't, ask questions that revealed his guilt. And while he panicked, I filed the lawsuit. The news broke 3 days before our scheduled meeting. Morrison versus Morrison, filed in County Superior Court, with myself as plaintiff and David Morrison as primary defendant. Natalie was listed as a co-defendant for her knowing participation in fraud and misappropriation of corporate assets. The local business journal ran it as a headline, "Family Drama at Historic Textile Company." The story had everything: betrayal, hidden millions, a young woman fighting for her inheritance against the family that raised her. My phone exploded with calls and texts. David, Patricia, Natalie, their lawyers, cousins I hadn't spoken to in years who suddenly had opinions about family loyalty. I ignored all of them except the one from David's lawyer, requesting an immediate meeting. I agreed with conditions. My lawyer present, official court reporter, recorded session. We met at a neutral location, conference room in a downtown office building. David looked older than I'd ever seen him, his face grey and deeply lined. Natalie sat beside him, vibrating with barely contained fury. Patricia hadn't come, the first crack in their united front. My lawyer, Catherine Brennan, was a woman in her 60s who'd built her reputation on corporate litigation. She'd listened to my story with no visible emotion, reviewed Dr. Torres's report with meticulous attention, and simply said, "They're going to suffer." Now she sat beside me, a leather portfolio in front of her, her expression pleasantly neutral. "Sienna," David began, his voice heavy with disappointed sadness, "I don't understand why you're doing this. After everything we've done for you, I have documentation," I interrupted calmly, "of every financial transaction involving my father's estate over the past 14 years. I have the original will, the authentic one, not the version you filed with the court. I have proof that you forged my signature on multiple legal documents when I was a minor. I have evidence of 3 shell companies receiving fraudulent payments from Morrison Textiles. And I have the cemetery records showing that you illegally moved my father's grave and took his burial plot for yourself." The room went absolutely silent. David's lawyer, a nervous man named Phillips, cleared his throat. "These are serious allegations, but they're not allegations," Catherine said pleasantly. "They're documented facts. We have bank records, email correspondence, testimony from the cemetery director, and a forensic accounting report completed by Dr. Rebecca Torres, who has testified in 43 fraud cases with a 100% success rate." "You have nothing," Natalie spat finally. "You're just bitter because you've never been able to measure up, never been able to—" "Dr. Rebecca Torres completed her forensic audit 2 months ago," I continued, as if Natalie hadn't spoken. "She's prepared to testify. I also have testimony from Mr. Williams, my father's original attorney, about the suspicious circumstances of his dismissal and his attempts to contact me about irregularities in the estate handling. And I have my father's journals, in his own handwriting, expressing concerns about David's gambling debts and his decision to protect my inheritance from David's creditors." I opened my briefcase and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table. "This is a summary. The full documentation is several thousand pages, but this gives you the essential points. Page 12 details the shell companies. Page 18 shows the forged signatures. Page 23 has the timeline of the cemetery plot switch, including David's signature on the transfer forms 2 days after you told me the arrangements were all handled. David's hand shook as he opened the folder. I watched him read, watched the blood drain from his face as he recognized documents he thought were hidden, evidence he'd assumed was destroyed. This is a complete accounting of what was taken from me, I said. Approximately $15 million in total, accounting for growth and proper investment. I'm willing to settle out of court for that amount, plus control of Morrison Textiles, plus the immediate transfer of cemetery plots to their proper designation, plus a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. That's insane, David said hoarsely. The company is worth $22 million, I corrected. I had it independently appraised by Morrison and Associates, no relation, 3 months ago. You've been undervaluing it for years to avoid taxes and hide asset transfers. That's also documented, and I've already flagged it for the IRS. Phillips had gone pale. You contacted the IRS? I filed a whistleblower report, I confirmed. If they find significant tax fraud, which they will, I'm entitled to a percentage of what they recover. But that's separate from this case. This is about my inheritance, my father's company, and my father's grave. If you refuse to settle, Catherine added, her voice pleasant but implacable, everything becomes public record. Every fraud, every forged signature, every stolen dollar. Your reputation in this city will be finished. Morrison Textiles will become synonymous with family betrayal and corporate theft, and you'll both likely face criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. The DA has already expressed interest. You can't do this, Natalie said, but her voice had lost its edge. She sounded young suddenly, almost childlike. We're family. I looked at her for a long moment. Natalie, who'd watched me struggle and never once offered help. Natalie, who'd taken credit for my ideas and promotions that should have been mine. Natalie, who'd stood outside my hospital room and laughed about where to bury me. No, I said quietly. You are my captors. Family doesn't steal, family doesn't erase, family doesn't stand outside a dying woman's hospital room and laugh about where to bury her. David's face went chalk white. You couldn't have heard that. You were dying? I smiled, and it was not a kind expression. I was, and then I wasn't. And I spent 7 years making sure that when this moment came, you would have absolutely no way out. The silence that followed was profound. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking, hear someone's breathing, Phillips, I think, gone rapid and shallow. How? Natalie whispered. How is that possible? It doesn't matter how, I said. What matters is that I remember everything. Every slight, every theft, every moment you made me feel small and grateful for scraps of what should have been mine. And I used that knowledge to build a case so airtight that your only choice is to settle or lose everything in public spectacle. They settled. It took 3 weeks of negotiation, 3 weeks of their lawyers desperately trying to find loopholes that didn't exist, 3 weeks of watching David age a decade, and Natalie slowly realised that everything she'd built her identity around was about to vanish. Patricia filed for divorce halfway through negotiations. She came to one meeting, listened to the evidence for exactly 12 minutes, then stood and walked out. The papers were served to David 2 days later. She would claim she'd been deceived, that she had never known the full extent of his fraud. It was probably true. Patricia had been content to enjoy the benefits without asking too many questions about their source. The final agreement gave me full control of Morrison Textiles, immediate transfer of all remaining estate assets, and the return of my father's grave to its proper location. David would retain his house, which would become Patricia's in the divorce, and a retirement fund of $500,000. Natalie would receive nothing. She'd been employed by the company, not entitled to its ownership. In exchange, I agreed not to pursue criminal charges, though I made no promises about cooperating with the IRS investigation that was now underway. I also insisted on one additional term: a public statement. David would write a letter to be published in the Business Journal, acknowledging that he had mishandled Robert Morrison's estate and that control of Morrison Textiles was being returned to its rightful heir. The letter would be brief, factual, and would run alongside an interview with me about my plans for the company. Catherine had advised against it. "You've won," she'd said. "Don't give them any platform, even a small one." But I needed it, not for revenge, but for closure, for my father's memory, for the record to show that David Morrison had not built this company, had not earned his position, had merely stolen it from a child too young to fight back. The day we signed the papers, David tried one last time to appeal to sentiment. "Sienna, I know I made mistakes, but I did care about you. I tried to provide. You provided exactly what someone provides when they want to keep their victim dependent," I said. "Just enough to survive, never enough to be free. You gave me a bedroom and food and claimed generosity while stealing millions. You paid for some of my college while sitting on life insurance money that should have covered everything. You thought I was stupid or weak or too traumatized to fight back. You were wrong." "I never thought you were stupid," he said, and for the first time he sounded sincere. "I thought you were like your mother, too soft for this world, too trusting." "My mother wasn't soft," I said. "She was broken by losing the man she loved and then watching his brother pretend to honor his memory while robbing his daughter. You didn't protect me from the world, David. You were the thing I needed protection from." He had nothing to say to that. Natalie sent me one email, 3 months after everything concluded. "I hope you're happy. You've destroyed everything." I didn't respond. She still didn't understand. I hadn't destroyed anything. I'd simply stopped allowing the destruction of myself. Morrison Textiles is thriving now. I brought in new management, cleaned out the corrupt practices, renegotiated supplier contracts. The employees who'd been loyal to the company, rather than to David's pocket, were promoted. Thomas became director of operations, his decades of experience finally recognized. The quality issues that had crept in under David's management were addressed systematically. I also implemented programs my father had written about in his journals, but never had time to execute. Profit sharing for long-term employees, apprenticeship programs for local high school students, sustainability initiatives that cost more upfront but aligned with my father's values. The company grew, not explosively, but steadily, sustainably. Revenue increased 18% in the first year, 32% in the second. We won back contracts David had lost through cheap materials and poor quality control. Our reputation shifted from affordable to reliable, from adequate to excellent. I had my father's remains moved back to the proper grave, the one overlooking the lake. The process was more complex than I'd anticipated. Permits, cemetery regulations, coordination with the funeral home. But I sat through every meeting, signed every form, made sure every detail was correct. The day they moved him, I was there. It was early morning, mist rising off the lake, the cherry tree heavy with spring blossoms. The cemetery workers were respectful, efficient. They lifted the casket with care as if my father could still feel their gentleness. I'd brought flowers, the kind he used to grow in our yard when I was small, bright yellow daylilies. I planted them around the headstone after everything was finished, my hands in the earth, tears running down my face for the first time in years. "I got it back, Dad," I whispered. "Everything they took. The company, the truth, your memory. I got it all back. The cherry tree blooms every spring now. I visit on his birthday and on the anniversary of his death. I don't believe he's there. Whatever my father was, whoever he was, exists only in my memory and in the company he built. But it matters that his name is on the stone that marks his space in the world. It matters that anyone who visits Riverside Memorial will see Robert Morrison, beloved father and visionary, in the plot he chose, surrounded by beauty. I'm 25 now, or 32, or some strange combination of both. I keep the memories of my first life private, locked away like my father's journals. Sometimes I wonder if I dreamed it, if the cancer and the betrayal and the lonely death were just the nightmares of a frightened teenager trying to make sense of loss. But then I look at the company thriving, at the space where my father rests, at the life I've built through patience and planning and refusing to be erased, and I know it was real. All of it was real. The pain, the death, the impossible return, and the victory that came from refusing to be a victim twice. Last week, I saw Natalie at a business conference. She was working for a competitor now, mid-level management. Her trajectory permanently stalled. She saw me on the stage during a panel discussion about ethical leadership in family businesses. Our eyes met for just a moment. She looked away first. I didn't gloat. I didn't feel the surge of vindictive pleasure I might have expected. I just felt nothing. She was irrelevant now, a person who'd once had power over me and no longer did. Her opinion, her judgment, her very existence had no bearing on my life. That absence of feeling was its own kind of freedom. After the panel, several young women approached me. One, a college student named Amy, asked how I'd managed to take control of a family business in such a male-dominated industry. It wasn't about the industry, I told her. It was about documentation, patience, and understanding that real power isn't taken, it's built. My father built something real. Someone tried to steal it. I spent years proving ownership and taking back what was mine. "But how did you know you'd win?" she asked. "Weren't you afraid?" I thought about that hospital room, about dying at 32 with nothing to show for my life but debt and regret, about waking up with a second chance and choosing to spend it becoming someone who couldn't be stolen from. I was terrified, I admitted, but I was more afraid of living the same life again, of being the same powerless person who let fear keep her small. Sometimes the only way to stop being afraid is to do the thing that terrifies you and survive it. She nodded, her expression serious, and I wondered what she was running from, what she was building toward. "One more thing," I said as she turned to leave. "Document everything, every conversation, every promise, every transaction. The truth only sets you free if you can prove it." The city looks different from my office window. 19th floor, corner office with a view of downtown and the river beyond. My father never had an office like this. Morrison Textiles was smaller then, scrappier, still proving itself. But I think he'd approve of the growth, the stability, the way the company bears his name with honour rather than as a stolen crown. There's a photograph on my desk, one I found in his journals. My father and me, age 6, standing in front of the original factory. I'm wearing a hard hat that's too big, grinning at the camera. He's looking down at me, his expression soft with love and pride. I remember that day now, both my childhood memory of it and the sharper, clearer memory of my first life where I'd forgotten it had ever happened. He told me that day that the company would be mine someday, that he was building something for me to inherit and grow. Not just money, he'd said, a legacy, something that means more than profit, something that takes care of people, creates value, stands for something good. I'm trying to honor that. Not perfectly. I'm human, I make mistakes, there are days when the pressure feels overwhelming, but I try to make decisions he'd respect, to build what he would have built if he'd lived. The company isn't just mine anymore. I've set up a trust, properly structured this time, that will transition ownership to employee shareholders when I die or retire. Morrison Textiles will never again be something one person can steal, can manipulate, can use as a personal bank account. I've also established the Robert Morrison Memorial Fund, which provides support for children who've lost parents and need help navigating estate issues. The lawyers who run it work pro bono, funded by company profits. We've helped 43 families so far, children who might otherwise have been victims like I was, who now have someone watching out for their interests. Patricia reached out last month, an email brief and formal asking if we could meet for coffee. I almost deleted it, but curiosity won. She looked older when we met, worn in a way that had nothing to do with physical age. We sat in a cafe downtown, expensive lattes between us, neither of us quite knowing how to start. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I should have seen what David was doing. I should have questioned, should have protected you. I was comfortable. I didn't want to look too closely at why we were comfortable." "You were his wife," I said neutrally. "You trusted him." "I was lazy," she corrected, "and greedy. Not as actively malicious as David, but complicit. I benefited from what he stole from you, and I didn't ask questions because I didn't want to know the answers." I didn't argue. It was true. "Natalie doesn't speak to me anymore," Patricia continued. "She blames me for not protecting her father, for not fighting harder in the divorce. She thinks I betrayed the family." "And what do you think?" "I think I stayed loyal to the wrong things for too long. Money over morality, comfort over courage." She met my eyes then. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that I see now what I chose not to see then, and I'm ashamed." We talked for another hour. She told me about the divorce, about selling the house, about the modest apartment she'd moved into, about therapy, about trying to understand how she'd become someone who could watch a child be robbed and call it family care. I didn't forgive her, but I appreciated the honesty. "What will you do?" I asked as we prepared to leave. "I'm volunteering," she said, "at a legal aid clinic, helping people navigate estate issues after losing family members. It's something, at least. A small way to balance the scales." I thought about the Morrison Memorial Fund, about the children we'd helped, about how harm, once done, can never be perfectly undone, but how the choice to stop causing harm, to actively work against it, matters anyway. "That's good," I said. "I hope it helps you find peace." We parted ways at the cafe door, and I haven't heard from her since. I don't expect to. Some relationships end not with dramatic confrontation, but with quiet acknowledgement that nothing more needs to be said. I'm dating now, something I never managed in my first life. Her name is Jennifer. She's a civil engineer, and she has no connection to my family or my company. We met at a bookstore, both reaching for the same architecture history book, and laughed about the cliché of it. She knows about my past, the version everyone knows at least. The lawsuit, the recovered inheritance, the family betrayal. She doesn't know about the cancer, about dying, about living twice. Some truths are too strange to share, too impossible to make others believe. But she knows the important things. That I value honesty over comfort. That I document carefully because I've learnt the cost of not having proof. That family, for me, is something built by choice rather than obligation. "You're careful," she observed once, after I declined to meet her parents until we'd been dating 6 months. "Like you're always expecting betrayal." "I'm cautious," I corrected. There's a difference. Expecting betrayal means living in fear. Being cautious means learning from experience and protecting what matters. And do I matter? She asked, not confrontationally, just curious. Yes, I said. That's why I'm careful. She'd kissed me then, and it felt like trust, like the slow building of something real. I don't know if we'll last. I don't know if I'm capable of the kind of vulnerability that long-term love requires. But I'm trying, learning to let someone close without giving them the power to destroy me. It's harder than defeating David ever was. Today is the anniversary of my father's death. 16 years since the car accident that took him too soon. I'm standing at his grave, the cherry tree full of pale pink blossoms, the lake reflecting morning sun. I've brought daylilies again. They've naturalized around the headstone, coming back each spring without my help now. A small permanence, a living memorial. The company's doing well, I tell him, though I don't believe he can hear. Revenue up 40% over 3 years. We just landed the Braden contract, remember them? The ones who said our materials weren't premium enough. Turns out when you don't cut corners, quality speaks for itself. The wind moves through the cherry branches, petals falling like gentle snow. Natalie's fine, I guess. Surviving. David's, I don't know, actually. I don't keep track. They're not my problem anymore. That's the truth I keep returning to. They're not my problem. They're not my responsibility. They're not the lens through which I view my life. They were obstacles, and I removed them, and now they're simply gone. I wish you were here, I say finally, not because I need help. I'm doing okay on my own, but because you deserved to see this. Deserved to know that what you built survived, that your daughter survived. I place the flowers, run my hand over the cool granite of the headstone. I didn't destroy them, Dad. I just outgrew them. And I think you'd be proud of that. The cherry tree sheds more petals, and I stand in their fall like a blessing. My victory was never revenge. It was becoming untouchable. It was building a life so solid, so true, so completely mine, that what others did to me became history rather than identity. It was choosing, every single day, to be someone my father would recognize, not the broken girl who died at 32, but the woman who learned from that death to live better, stronger, more deliberately. I walk back to my car, back to the life waiting for me. Board meeting at 10, lunch with Jennifer at 1, site visit to the new facility at 3. A full day, a full life, a future I am building with every choice. Behind me, the cherry tree blooms on, marking where my father rests, proof that some things endure beyond theft and betrayal and even death itself. I drive away without looking back, the sun rising higher, the day unfolding with possibility. Free.